We know that God hates divorce. Malachi 2 tells us that. We know that there is at least one exception to whether or not a man or a woman can divorce, and that's spelled out for us in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19 by Jesus, who says that the grounds of adultery are valid grounds for a man or a woman to divorce their spouse, but not any other grounds. At least Jesus didn't spell out any. Until we come to Paul's writings in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where he talks about the fact that a man is married to a woman, a man who is a Christian is married to a woman who is not a Christian, or vice versa. A woman who's a Christian is married to a man who's not a Christian. You can't divorce them just because they're not a Christian. Once the decision to marry is made, it is a lifelong commitment. However, in the last video, we talked about the fact that this exception clause that Paul is spelling out is called desertion by a non-believer. In other words, if a non-believer says, I don't want to be married to you anymore, and walks out of the marriage, let them go. Paul is saying, you have the right to let them go. Now, that doesn't mean you let them go immediately. It doesn't mean that you give up on the marriage. You do everything in your power to seek counsel, to seek advice, to ask people who are your spiritual mentors what they think, etc. But if it ends up where the unbelieving spouse says, I don't want to be married to you anymore, and walks out of the marriage, you are to let them go. However, in that particular passage in 1 Corinthians 7, it says in verse 15, if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. Now that word separates has been translated in other versions many different ways, but one of the ways in which it's translated is if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. If the unbeliever walks out of the marriage, let him walk out of the marriage. But what constitutes desertion by a non-believer? You know, today in the culture in which we live, people are so quick to give up on their marriages. They're so quick to look at maybe some dysfunction in the home. Many women hate their husbands and vice versa. Paul's already warned in that very same passage about the responsibility to live before your children a life that exposes them to the Holy Spirit. And we're so quick to walk out of the marriage. And many Christians have over the years told me, I deserve to be happy. And since I'm not happy, I can walk out of this marriage, and Paul gives me the right to do so in this passage right here. He said, they'll say to you, my husband's not a believer. I'm tired of living with him as a non-believer. I want to walk out of the marriage. So what does constitute grounds for desertion by a non-believer? Now, it's interesting that 1 Corinthians 7 is in the context of a whole slew of scriptures on church discipline. There's a whole passage where Paul is dealing with incestual relationships in the church. And there's a man who's a very famous Christian in the church. He's involved with a woman who is a very powerful woman in the church, but she's not his wife, she's his stepmother. And they're having a physical relationship with each other. Paul hears about this, he learns about this. The church was winking at it. They would just turn and look the other way because these were two influential Christians, or two influential people in the church. And Paul says they need to face the spiritual leadership of the church. They need to face church discipline. In fact, he says to them, like the billboard a few years ago used to say, don't make me come down there. And it was always signed by God. Don't make me come down there. Paul said to them, don't make me come down there. You must deliver this person over for the destruction of the flesh so that in the day of judgment their soul might be saved. In other words, he's saying to them, winking at this incestuous relationship, you have no right to do this. There needs to be church discipline. Now that's the context of 1 Corinthians 7, where he talks about the believer married to the non-believer. So he introduces to us the whole idea of the spiritual leadership of the church. And he says, you must appeal to the spiritual leadership of the church to determine whether or not you have grounds for divorce. So let's say a man is married to a woman and he's a Christian, she's not. He wants to leave her because she's not a Christian. He might say to her, she's walked out of the marriage. Well, what does he mean by that? She's walked out of the marriage. What constitutes the myriad of things that could happen in a marriage that would serve up as desertion by a non-believer? That's where the spiritual leaders of the church have to come together. Now, friends, let me be honest with you. There are women who face abuse every day of their lives from their spouses. Christian women are beat up just as much as non-Christian women are beat up by unbelieving spouses. Is a woman bound to stay in that kind of a marriage? There was a situation that I had many years ago where a man used to tie his wife down and literally just beat her to a pulp. But he said, "You can't divorce me because you're a Christian. I'm not a Christian, but you can't divorce me." Would something like that constitute grounds for divorce? If the woman were to appeal to her leadership, to her session, to her elders, to her deacons, whatever authority structure that she's under, and say to them, "I need you to help me determine whether or not my husband has deserted this marriage." Now, what I'm saying to you is this: to desert a marriage does not necessarily mean that a man geographically leaves the home or a woman geographically leaves the home. What I'm saying to you is that you could leave the marriage in a whole myriad of ways. You can desert your spouse in a whole myriad of ways. But you can't make that determination yourself. You need counsel. You need people to come around you that understand. Maybe they'll interview your husband, your wife, and find out exactly what their side of the story is. And maybe you'll find out that no, you haven't been deserted, that the tensions have just run over into the hot zone. I just want to encourage you that this is not a decision you make by yourself. This exception clause that Paul seems to be giving us here has to be done in conjunction with, in consultation with, what he spelled out a couple of chapters earlier about submitting to the discipline and government of the church. Well, I got to tell you, there aren't too many churches that will practice this. A lot of churches will not want to practice this. They'll look at this and say, "That's your business, that's not my business." Well, in that particular case, you need to seek the multitude of counselors, of people who understand the biblical principles of divorce and remarriage. In those situations where you are either divorced on the grounds of adultery, the exception clause that Jesus spelled out, or divorced on the grounds of desertion by a non-believer, in both of those cases, you are free to remarry, but only in the Lord. If you get an unscriptural divorce, you're not free to remarry. And if you do remarry, you marry in adultery. And so the consequences of that sin will follow you and your children for generations to come. Divorce, remarriage, and the church is to be treated with dignity and respect and careful counsel. And I would encourage you to seek as many biblical counselors as you can to get a good feel for what grounds you do have or don't have. Otherwise, God cannot bless any remarriage.
Hi, my name is Melissa Weisenfels, Executive Director here at Mark Inc. Ministries. Thank you so very much for your continued support of this video series. Ask Dr. Betters is not meant to be a substitute for professional counseling, but instead is designed to extract biblical principles around the questions being asked. We encourage you to seek professional counseling if needed.